What if I told you that your right to speak freely isn't really a right at all, but a privilege, granted or taken away depending on who or how you challenge? I saw this firsthand when my friend was doxed in college for speaking out against Israel's occupation. Instead of practicing their free speech, our university folded to Zionist pressure and silenced my friend. Now we're watching the same thing play out on a national scale. Take Mohamad Khalil, a student activist arrested and detained under vague national security charges, not because he committed a crime, but because he dared to protest the wrong people. None of this is new, however. From COINTELPRO to Standing Rock, the US has always criminalized dissent, because dissent is what forces us to decide what our human rights are, rather than letting a government or a state define our human rights for us. So in this video, I'm asking, if free speech comes with punishment, was it ever really free to begin with? Why does the state protect some forms of speech and deem other forms of speech dangerous, even when both are violent? And most importantly, who really decides our rights? The state or the people who refuse to be silent? Because here's the truth. Human rights are not granted. They are fought for. I knew after seeing the Mohamad Khalil case at Columbia and reading a lot of the news that I had to make this video. When I was in university, I saw a sort of similar situation. When it was my senior year, it was 2014, 2015, another assault on the Gaza Strip was happening. And when I was a senior, I had joined student government as a part of a radical student ticket. And around that time, the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge was happening, which was this social media challenge to challenge people to pour up buckets of ice on themselves to raise money for ALS research. I had a friend who was student senate president, radical, queer, lesbian, just really cool person. They were challenged by a university president to do the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. They responded by pouring a fake bucket of blood on themselves and saying, divest from funding Israel. We need to be a part of BDS, and really pressured the university. And what I saw in the coming weeks was liberal and suburban students being unable to grasp the notion of a genocide, the notion of power imbalance, the notion of nuance, the notion of universities being tied to liberalism. People arguing with my friends saying that their tactic was too drastic and they didn't understand how many Jewish lives were at risk. And I saw thousands of death threats come my friend way. They were reached out to by the Secret Service. They had private meetings with the university where they were told, basically, we're not going to protect you and you shouldn't have fucking done this. The university put out statements to denigrate what my friend had done. The university supported civil free speech. And while all this was happening, my friend's mental health declined. They were sent thousands of death threats from all around the world. At one point, they had local police flashing flashlights into their windows as a scare tactic to dissuade them. In this situation, I saw there are certain forms of speech that are protected by the elite, by institutions. The Zionist students on my campus that were spewing propaganda and spreading lies about people and showing up to student senate meetings and protesting. Yes, they were arrested, but they weren't charged. They weren't charged with anything. Do you think the university tried to probably charge my friend with something? Yes. The difference between speaking to power and being aligned with power in the ways that we're dissenting, in the ways that we're speaking out. And then throughout that year, I was calling out the university administration about Black Lives Matter, about cultural competency. My senior year, in a lot of ways, was a masterclass in understanding how media lies, how institutions encourage people to align with their goals, their whims, and how what we're seeing right now with Mohamad Khalil at Columbia and everything that's happening in our government is very clearly telling us what Trump and his cronies have told us, what Project 2024 has been trying to tell us, which is if you don't align with patriotism, if you don't align with the orange man who's fuck you, and you can have your green card taken away, and you can have your birthright citizenship taken away, and they can change all the rules. Have we ever really had a freedom of speech? Or is it freedom of speech with conditions? Is it freedom of speech? Is it contingent upon our modes of resistance? To break down a little bit of what's happened in recent events, especially related to Columbia University, Mohamad Khalil is a Palestinian-born student and legal permanent resident of the United States. And recently, Mohamad Khalil was arrested while entering or exiting his Columbia housing by DHS, by ICE. And initially, he was told that his student visa has been revoked, when in actuality, further down the line, it was learned that Mohamad Khalil did not have a student visa. For over 24 hours, his lawyer and his partner were unable to figure out where he was because they weren't given accurate information. And when they did find out where he was, after being arrested in New York, he was in Louisiana. A lot of reports are speaking to the fact that Mohamad Khalil was a very prominent negotiator during the protests, that he didn't actually organize these protests. It is also well known that he has been experiencing a doxing campaign for the past number of weeks. And the day before he was detained by ICE, by DHS, he reached out to Columbia University and spoke about how he feared for his safety because of this ongoing doxing campaign. And mind you, these things are all connected, and I don't think we should look at what's happening at Columbia and view it as something that's separate. Before this happened, Columbia lost upwards of $400 million of funding because of the Trump administration's perception of their reaction to the protests, even though these protests were related to being anti-war and anti-genocide. This attack on universities, this attack on DEI is happening in cities all around the U.S., and we should expect this repression to spread. Here in the city that I live in, at Ohio State University, when the protests were happening last year, I showed up to an encampment protest, and it was a very chill morning. It actually wasn't going to be happening that morning, and things were canceled, and the schedule was kind of mixed up. But I showed up with a friend. We biked there, went and chatted a few people up. We're biking and leaving. I was stopped by 2 police vans that had like 5 cops in it each, all in vests, all with their guns. They pulled me over. They said, "Oh, we're stopping you because you're riding on the sidewalk." What the fuck ever? They asked me how I knew my friend by name, even though they had never come up to us that day before, why I was there, if I was visiting. They also asked to search my bag. They specifically said, "Oh, is there anything sharp in here that might injure us or anything that we should know about?" These are leading questions that cops ask to try to get you to criminalize yourself. Didn't really answer any questions, and I let them search my bag, and then they let me go. That is a tactic of intimidation, to survey people that are in a space, follow people after, and to unduly question them. And so this video is going to be exploring why freedom of speech matters, how it's been on the chopping block all throughout U.S. history, some of the things that we should be considering in this moment. So to kind of go over what has been happening at Columbia recently, Mohamad Khalil is a Palestinian-born student and legal permanent resident in the U.S. who was a prominent negotiator and activist during the 2024 Palestine protests at Columbia University. He acted as a negotiator. He tried to communicate between the encampment protesters and the administration to get demands met that students and faculty. On March 8th, 2025, after weeks of online harassment and doxing, Mohamad Khalil was arrested by U.S. Immigration and Custom Enforcement agents at his university-owned apartment in Manhattan. Despite being a legal permanent resident, his detention was ordered under a seldom invoked provision of the 1952 Immigration and Naturalization Act, allowing deportation of individuals deemed threats to U.S. foreign policy. Following his arrest, Khalil was transferred to a detention facility in Louisiana, without any communication with his lawyers, without any communication with his wife. We can view this in a lot of ways as the state actively trying to disappear someone. Come March 10th, 2025, Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced intentions to revoke visas and green cards of individuals considered supporters of Hamas, a designation that applied to Khalil without public evidence. March 11th, 2025, Khalil's legal team filed motions challenging his detention, arguing that his arrest was an attempt to suppress lawful political dissent protected under the First Amendment. And then moving forward, protests erupt at Columbia and other universities nationwide. Come March 14th, a federal judge issued a temporary stay on Khalil's deportation, requiring the government to provide evidence supporting its claims and allowing Khalil's legal team time to prepare a defense. Also, I read news that Trump Tower, there was a protest there where a bunch of folks were arrested. Close to 24 students have had their degrees revoked. Revoked. Can you fucking imagine? You go to Columbia University, which is probably like $50,000-$60,000 a year, and then it's revoked? We can see this climate where people are being unjustly targeted and surveyed, and repression is real, and it's happening. Has freedom of speech ever really existed if it includes the expectation of punishment if you speak out in a way that doesn't align with white supremacy or patriotism, or colonization or capitalism? Does it really exist? To understand how free speech has been weaponized, we have to start by looking back at U.S. history. We have to look back at how it has criminalized dissent through war, through surveillance, through war, through surveillance, and through outright violence. Smack dab in the middle of 2016, a storm was brewing on the plains of what we now call North Dakota. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe rose in defiance against the Dakota Access Pipeline, a $3.8 billion project threatening their ancestral lands and the lifeblood of their community, the Missouri River. By April 2016, the tribe had established the Sacred Stone Camp, a beacon calling warriors and water protectors from all corners to stand against the encroaching Black Snake. As the sun blazed, thousands converged, transforming the protest into a global symbol of Indigenous resistance. But the pipeline's backers, energy transfer partners, were unyielding. In September 2016, they enlisted TigerSwan, a private security firm with roots in U.S. military operations, to dismantle the uprising. Documents later revealed TigerSwan's deployment of counterterrorism tactics, painting water protectors as insurgents in their homeland. This clash between Indigenous guardians and the corporate mercenaries marked a pivotal chapter in the ongoing battle for sovereignty, environmental justice, and the right to dissent. And this article goes on to describe the far-reaching surveillance of TigerSwan. It says, TigerSwan organized its surveillance work like a full-fledged state intelligence agency, but on a smaller scale. The company divided the intelligence operation into teams focused on human intelligence, imagery intelligence, signals intelligence, intercepting communications, and open source intelligence based on news reports or other publicly available material like social media posts. The TigerSwan teams worked out of fusion centers, the same state term law enforcement agencies use to describe a network of post-9/11 information sharing offices located in Bismarck, North Dakota, Des Moines, Iowa, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, according to an organizational chart. The imagery intelligence team included an operative who took photographs of the camp from a helicopter, while the signals team monitored water protectors' radio communications. At times, on radios, TigerSwan operatives would add their own disruptive messages, according to a former member of the intelligence team. Key to the security operation was the use of infiltrators. Having TigerSwan CI/HUMINT infiltrators on the ground is critical in minimizing lost construction time. And this article goes on to talk about how there were infiltrators in camps that would try to get to the more militant camps like Red Warrior. There were infiltrators that would try to be in meetings, talk to elders in the movement, try to encourage courses of action that were more violent and could theoretically be more easily criminalized by this. When I was in Standing Rock, there was a Dakota Access Pipeline employee that had a car and tried to drive through a crowd of protesters, was run off of the road, stopped, came out of the car, pulled a handgun on the crowd, and later was revealed to have an AR-15 in the car. And it was pretty much known that he was planning to go to the main camp, Ochedi to light the place up. And what Standing Rock reveals again and again is that certain bodies, certain forms of dissent are just inherently categorized in the category of criminalized dissent. I mean, the fact that journalists were detained and questioned unjustifiably, the fact that when I was there, helicopters would be flying over the camp at all hours of the night. This surveillance and paranoia led to certain elements of the movement policing each other and mistreating each other. I remember there was one particular day where this new camp was erected and I had friends go to this camp. It was basically a camp that was in the next path of the pipeline, And I remember that day watching people get dragged out of teepees, watching people get shot at with rubber bullets, watching people try to gather their belongings while the state was coming in with batons and gas masks and throwing tear gas into the crowds and using their LRADs. LRAD is like a machine that puts off this fucked up sound and you're like, oh my God, I can't fucking hear anything. And you hear, your ears are ringing for hours on end afterwards. These are weapons of war. These are weapons of war being used against people exercising their right to protest after they've experienced generations of colonization. And if freedom of speech isn't protected for people that are marginalized or being exploited, who is it protected for? Who is the right to speak out and to dissent? Who is it actually for? And in this scenario, if you compare Standing Rock to the January 6th protesters and what happened to them and how they were treated and how they've been since released. And some of them have been released. And because some of them were arrested because of January 6th, they were found out for other crimes, right? They were found out like, oh, you robbed somebody or you had a warrant. These people were not only freed from their January 6th charges for going into the Capitol and fucking it up and killing police officers, they were also released from charges that were only discovered because of their arrest from January 6th. And so due process doesn't exist. Freedom of speech doesn't exist. It exists for certain groups of people. It exists for white people, for white supremacists, for fascists. But does it exist for the regular citizen like you or me? Does it exist for an undocumented person, for someone who has a green card or a visa? And why? How does the government benefit if it doesn't protect our freedom of speech? And I don't want to put it lightly, my experiences in Standing Rock. You drive there and you know there's going to be checkpoints. You know that your car could be searched. You know that the cops could harass you, that if you have charges or whatever else from another situation, that it could mix things up there. And I remember that day of watching all of that police violence and really just thinking again and again, history repeats itself. Colonization has terrorized these communities before, and it's here to terrorize them again. And that was honestly the first time in my life where I think I experienced political trauma. Like, I would leave Standing Rock and go back to my hometown, and I would hear people's screams in my head. When I was out at bars, I would have this feeling of dread, like something bad was about to happen. I would kind of disassociate on a regular basis. And the thought I had again and again was, if I experienced this there and it was so important, how does the rest of my life even matter now? Like, why am I not just there all the time? And I think the mistake that the state makes when they repress people, when they expose people to all these different forms of state violence, is yes, there is the reaction of repression and isolationism and doomerism, but you also piss people off. You also teach people the truth of what our government is willing to do to hide the truth. I think that period of time just really committed me to the fact you can't fucking trust this government. You can't let this shit run. I mean, Obama was president during part of that movement, and then Trump became president. And either side of the aisle, the violence against Indigenous folks, that the protesters being sprayed with ice cold water when it was freezing temperatures outside, the fact that TigerSwan handed information over to government officials, the fact that they were infiltrating movement, the precedent that set, I think, leads us to the reality of what we're seeing right now. In 2016, around that same time, there was the Republican National Convention that was happening in my home city of Cleveland, Ohio.
Establishing a protest zone in Cleveland hasn't been easy. You run up against two different thoughts: security versus freedom of speech. Eventually, there was a compromise. And this is it, at least where it begins. West 20th and Lorraine on Cleveland's near west side, close to transportation and wide open. But unless you're up at altitude, you can't see the arena. It's a good mile away with a river in between.
Which is why demonstrators will be allowed to march or parade about 1.75 miles toward downtown over a predetermined route that took months of negotiation.
And I actually did reporting on this, but I'll read a bit from The Intercept. FBI and police are knocking on activist doors ahead of the Republican National Convention. Law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, have been knocking on the doors of activists and community organizers in Cleveland, Ohio, asking about their plans for the RNC in July. The purpose of these door knocks is simple: to intimidate the target and others in efforts to discourage people from engaging in lawful First Amendment rights. More than a dozen people in Cleveland have reported being visited this week by local police, FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and Secret Service. And the FBI confirmed that these visits had taken place. Maggie Rice, an organizer with Food Not Bombs, said that members of her group were visited by police, but felt too rattled to speak to a reporter. And I legit interviewed someone I knew in high school that this had happened to. They were door knocked. They were heavily involved with a local Black Lives Matter chapter, and FBI agents basically told them, if you are caught or prominently seen at this RNC when shit is going down, we're going to make sure you get some fucked up charges. We're going to make sure. This person I interviewed after the police left said that in the coming weeks that they would come home and they'd find random people on their porch. They would find random pieces of mail in their mailbox, and eventually they move. It's the state coming into a city, this event leading to more of a focus on criminalizing dissent, on targeting certain kinds of people. If you haven't done anything yet, why are police at your door? If you haven't done anything yet, why are police at your door? If you haven't done anything yet, why are police at your door? And could they just fucking set you up if they already know where you live and they know who you hang out with? It's not just about the threat. It's about what the threat means. It's about the accessibility that the state is proving that they have to you, that they can just knock on your door and fucking talk to you or Sally or your neighbor and pay someone off and get them to do whatever. What about the brakes on your car? What about the devices in your home? Who has been to your home while you've been away? Who that you know could be susceptible to state surveillance or influence? Who around you could potentially be a snitch? Who around you could potentially be a counterinsurgent? That this is a part of a larger history of FBI interference and entrapment, which also happened in Cleveland as well. In 2012, 3 people were arrested and sentenced to prison for their roles in a plot to bomb an Ohio bridge.
Not guilty. The 5 men accused of plotting to bomb a local bridge say they aren't guilty of the crime. The 5 men were back in court today, along with dozens of supporters.
About 50 members of Occupy Cleveland occupied a federal courtroom in support of the men accused of trying to blow up the Route 82 bridge in Brecksville. News Channel 5's John Cossack was in the courtroom and spoke with some of those supporters today. And John, they're saying they were set up.
Supporters of Connor Stevens, at least, Lee, pretty much saying exactly that they feel that the 20-year-old from Berea was coerced into this.
All of these people are standing here for him.
Supporters of 20-year-old Connor Stevens of Berea gather outside federal court moments after Stevens, along with co-defendants Brandon Baxter, Anthony Hain, Joshua Stafford, and Douglas Wright, all pleaded not guilty to charges related to the use of a weapon of mass destruction in a foiled plot to blow up the Route 82 bridge last week over the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. Stevens' sister says don't lump him in with the others.
He had a planned plot in this, as anyone else did, but everyone is different and individual. So you need to look at them as individual people and not 5 people being tried as monster terrorists.
Prosecutors say the group bought their fake explosives from undercover FBI agents who were working with an informant in the group, which had ties to Occupy Cleveland. Breland Stevens says that informant pressured her brother.
The informant approached these 5 men, gave them jobs, gave them money, gave them a place to, was promising them places to live. Connor said, I did not want to be a part of this.
Especially these 4 people were lost at that point, trying to figure out what to do. They had been living at the encampment. They'd been doing, as you said, Food Not Bombs work, trying to build relationships with the community, trying to take care of people, interested in doing more demonstrations, trying to be more effective in doing those demonstrations. And they were also dealing with a lot of their own personal issues, battling addiction, dealing with mental health issues. And so for a lot of reasons, just in very vulnerable points when Azir came in and preyed upon that and took their wanting to try and do more, to be more effective in challenging the evil forces of capitalism, and he exploited that and tried to manipulate them in different ways, as they were talking about wanting to have more effective demonstrations, to have better gear for going out to demonstrations and things like that. He's the one who started introducing ideas of explosives.
And so he was also at this point like providing them with employment opportunities as well as drugs and alcohol, money, support, almost like a father figure type thing.
Very much so. He was, promising them places to live and things like that. Something that I don't know how much has been publicized about the case is that a lot of the conversations that he was having with them were as he was driving them to work he was in the business of flipping houses. And so he was having them work on his houses. And so a lot of these conversations were as he's driving them to job sites and then at job sites. So it wasn't just that they were talking to someone who was someone else who they thought was from the community or something. He was very much taking on that role of father figure, and they saw him as his boss that they were having these conversations with. So he was, there were all kinds of power dynamics that he was exploiting through these relationships.
So throughout the case, so the steps in the actual case, they were picked up on the 30th of April in 2012 for having attempted to place these fake explosives that were purchased through Shaquille Azir from FBI agents who were undercover at the base of this bridge outside of Cleveland to make a big impact on capitalism on May 1st, right?
Yeah.
And then they went back to a restaurant and one of them attempted to explode the bridge and it didn't, and then they were picked up there. Can you talk a little bit about what their case looked like from that point on?
Yeah, from that point, I mean, they were very much dealing with being prosecuted as terrorists. We've seen like the large trend of that since 9/11, where the government has been going after these terrorism prosecutions and, wanting to create this idea that the government is keeping us safe from terrorists. But these are not the only people who have been entrapped through government-created plots. So the government creates this idea of terrorism that was going to happen, and then the government swooping in as the heroes and putting an end to it. And so we need to look at the framework in that broader scope and looking at how the government is manufacturing terrorism so that then they can show that they are putting an end to it. And it's ridiculous and needs to be questioned. And these people, the Cleveland Four, in their cases, got to unfortunately experience that at that very personal level, going through, as soon as they were arrested, being put in solitary confinement, not having a lot of access to court resources, not having a lot of legal support, struggling to have community support.
They had the whole world against them is what it felt like. And the government, like, you make the good point of saying that the government, like, set up in this case and has in a number of other circumstances, including and mostly against Muslim Americans, has set up these cases where somebody was angry about something, and so this informant steps in and is like, oh, well, yeah, I'm angry about that too. You're not angry enough, though. Let's go do some stuff. And like, oh, here, I can get you this stuff. And it just kind of plants the seeds, provides the supposed opportunities, which are oftentimes through their FBI handlers and faked to make sure the circumstance goes out safely. But as I understand, the Four, when they talked about upping the ante and like taking radical action from that next step, wasn't necessarily anything that was going to threaten human safety. It was symbolic actions like damaging signs outside of banks, blowing up bank signs maybe. When Shaquille Azir introduces the idea of like, no, that's not enough. We need to up the ante and we need to get like big explosives and all this stuff.
Yeah, you can look at like throughout his time with them, they were talking about wanting things like gear to wear to protest because cops are using violent tactics, and they were wanting things like paint bombs or maybe pepper spray, things like that are definitely a different realm of things than talking about explosives. And they repeatedly also expressed that they didn't want to hurt anyone, even when, talk started to form about the bridge. Multiple times they were trying to back out of it. They were asking questions about, when would people not be on the bridge? So always expressing that interest in not hurting people, but just wanting to find ways to impact capitalism.
And this is within like the framework for people who are listening. Like you said, it's the end of Occupy, which is this very like vaguely populist time. A lot of people got radicalized through this period. And these are young, passionate people who very much want to help people through their activism and through their charity work. Or while these young men were angry and were incited and wanted to do something, and it just took this person working on behalf of the federal government to have them say some stupid stuff and plan to do something that was really stupid, especially through peer pressure.
Yeah, and even Brandon, I know in particular with some of what you just talked about, his dad's house was in the process of being foreclosed on as this was going on, and Azir was offering to help his dad get out of that situation. So even at that very core personal level, he was manipulating them based on their family circumstances at this rough financial time.
But we can look at it through the lens of the state actively trying to incriminate people and set the dominoes in motion to lock people up. I mean, one of these people was sentenced to 11 and a half years in jail. Yeah, looking at the photos of these people, I'm like, this is fucking crazy. And then moving on, of course, we can look at 2020 and the George Floyd protests. Obviously, the protests rose up all around the country, all around the world. What did various cities try to do? They tried to make free speech zones. What the fuck is a free speech zone? A free speech zone? I thought outside. I thought my house is supposed to be a free speech zone. And these zones were heavily policed and strategically placed away from media centers, effectively limiting the impact of dissent. And people were often arrested for venturing outside of these boundaries. How does the state change its rules? How does it change and reconfigure public versus private space in order to criminalize certain kind of bodies and allow others to exist there? And I remember in my city that cars were trying to run people over. I remember I was at one protest where it was outside of the police headquarters, and this car was angry that the road was blocked, and they tried to drive onto the sidewalk, and they almost ran into a fucking baby stroller. They almost ran into a baby stroller. In America, we have a public that is, their expectation because of their class position or political position or whatever is to never have to deal with dissent. But it's also like, if you're wealthy or you hoard power or you're someone who's suburban and you go into an urban environment when protests are happening, you're not expecting to be inconvenienced. This leads to legalization of violence against protesters. In April of 2021, Oklahoma enacted House Bill 1674, which grants civil and criminal immunity to drivers who unintentionally harm individuals while fleeing a riot. The bill was introduced following a 2020 incident in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when a driver, fearing for their safety, allegedly drove through a crowd of protesters on an interstate, resulting in injuries. The legislation also classified the unlawful obstruction of streets as a misdemeanor. And so once again, I asked the question, how do these practices relate to this notion of protected speech and criminalized dissent during the 2024 George Floyd protests? AI, free speech zones, National Guard being brought onto university campuses. I mean, it is a scary moment in history right now. The fact that in my state, neo-Nazis both came to the city that I live in now, and then roughly a month later, they also went to Lincoln Heights, Ohio, and they showed up en masse. They showed up with guns and signs and Nazi slogans and fucking symbols, and they didn't have a permit. And they started yelling at local business owners. They started harassing people in cars by a school. And what happened when the police were called? The police showed up and helped these people.
Back, guys, back. Bro, it ain't worth it, man.
It is. You know
it's not worth it.
You know it is.
It ain't worth it.
The police showed up and escorted these neo-Nazis away. And these were people that gathered without a permit. And you already know, you already know, I don't fuck a permit. But the fact that the neo-Nazis get to show up without a permit and it's not a fucking problem. Think about the Black Panther Party and them exercising their right to bear arms, and how the state of California literally tried to change their laws to disallow this from happening, to disallow open carrying from happening. And what this comes back to again and again for me, and why I think being a Black person in media, a radical person in media in this moment is so important, is because I'm never going to stop exercising my right to speak my mind. And that right, I believe, isn't given to me by a government. It's given to me by myself. And our ability to speak up against disinformation, our ability to talk about the militarism and capitalism of it all, our ability to look at history and to understand that the criminalization of dissent is an American practice. It's a practice of colonization, and it should be teaching us the importance of solidarity. How are we connected in communities in a way that allow us to protect each other if DHS or ICE or immigration shows up? What will you do? Who can you call if someone knocks on your door and is asking you questions about what you've done or what people around you have done, what your political affiliations are? How can we protect each other? How can we check in on people that are being doxxed or being exposed to these varying forms of digital and physical and state violence? And I've been processing this moment by situating it in history and understanding that this is a continuation of what we've experienced in the past, and how it's important to set up processes and systems of care. Are we using encrypted forms of messaging? Are we leaving less evidence behind that the state can just pick up? Are we vetting people that are coming into our political spaces? Are we sharing information only on a need-to-know basis? Are we connected to legal organizations that can help us and step in? And are we willing to resist in order to protect our safety and our freedom of speech. Your rights only truly exist if you're willing to fight for them. Standing Rock, Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd protests, all of them prove one thing again and again, that the U.S. is only there to protect the systems that uphold power, that dominate, that survey, that profit. And every right that we have ever won has been through struggle. The civil rights movement, Dissent was met with police dogs, tear gas, and assassinations. The labor rights movement, strikes and protesters met with bullets. When they come for the next activist, the next movement, the next truth teller, what will you do? And I really want to encourage people to not only pay attention to this case with Mohamad Khalil, but to pay attention to what's happening in other universities, to pay attention to what's happening locally. I know here in my city, there's going to be protests related to OSU. And I'm going to be paying attention. I'm going to be trying to show up. I'm going to be trying to talk to my community and figuring out the ways that we can protect each other and learn and grow in our ways, in our capacity to fight repression. And obviously all of this does make me, the security culture and sabotage video is going to come sooner rather than later. I'm going to do work on it over the next month or so and try to get it out soon. But I do think all of this is showing me that security culture is important, that the practices that I have had are important, and that I also can learn and grow. And security culture is as simple as, if you're going to a meeting and taking notes, make sure you know who's going to that meeting. Make sure you're not taking notes anywhere that someone can just, take it, send it to somebody else. Be careful, especially if you're doing things that you don't want the state to know who's doing it and why. And really, really just take care of each other. Just take care of each other. And oh God, it's just wild. It's just wild. And subscribe for more deep dives into anti-capitalism, into history. Head to my Patreon to get early access to videos like this and so many others. And look out for each other. Pay attention to what's happening, and don't let the fucking government tell you what your rights are, because if you let them tell you what your rights are, slavery could be coming back in a big way, beyond prisons. Yeah. See you later.